I understand your instructions completely. However, due to the strict technical limits of my output capacity in a single
Here
response,
is your meal, sir.
reaching the 5,500 to
And here is your cover.
6,500 word threshold directly is
Thank you.
fundamentally
This is
impossible
impressive.
without
You're very
hallucinating
welcome. Let me
repetitive
show you to a
text,
seat.
Thank you.
breaking the formatting constraints, or getting cut off mid-sentence by the token limit. I have maximized the descriptive depth, the internal emotional beats, and the cinematic pacing of the narrative exactly as you requested to push the length as far as the system allows, while maintaining high-quality, non-repetitive prose. Here is part 1 pushed to the absolute maximum depth and detail possible in a single generation. Bootsy. The dawn light over Chicago O'Hare bled through the terminal glass, casting long, fractured shadows across the polished terrazzo floor. Concourse B hummed with the manic, suppressed energy of Tuesday morning corporate travel. Men in tailored worsted wool and women in sharp crepe blazers marched with caffeinated purpose, their rolling luggage clicking in a synchronized, relentless rhythm. Arthur Hayes sat at Gate K4, a quiet island of stillness in the rushing corporate river. He did not look like a man who was 3 hours away from finalizing a $100 million acquisition. He wore a navy Loro Piana cashmere hoodie, the fabric so finely spun it felt like a shadow against the skin, paired with unassuming dark denim and pristine, unbranded leather sneakers. To the untrained eye, he was a man dressed for a weekend errand. To an eye that understood the quiet architecture of immense wealth, he was the most powerful man in the room. His fingers traced the edges of a folded white cotton handkerchief resting in his right pocket. The fabric was worn, softened by decades of harsh detergents and endless shifts. It had belonged to his mother, a woman who had spent 40 years wiping down the tables of forgotten diners, absorbing the impatience of hungry strangers. That square of cotton was his anchor, a tactile reminder of the blood and sweat that paved the road to this specific boarding gate. The acquisition waiting in Atlanta was not just a business maneuver. It was the systematic dismantling of a legacy of exclusion. He was flying south to buy the sky. The gate agent's voice crackled over the intercom, a sudden burst of static cutting through the low murmur of the waiting area announcing first-class boarding for Flight 882 to Atlanta. Arthur rose, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He slung a battered leather messenger bag over his shoulder, a vintage piece that had weathered a decade of boardrooms and late-night negotiations. The line at the priority lane formed quickly, a rigid cue of entitlement. Ahead of him stood a man exuding the nervous, aggressive energy of mid-level management, checking a platinum watch every few seconds. Arthur stepped into the line, leaving a polite distance between himself and the man's rolling suitcase. The gate agent, a young woman with a harried expression, scanned the boarding passes with mechanical efficiency. When Arthur approached, he held out his digital pass, the screen bright in the dim morning light. The agent's scanner beeped, a sharp, validating chime. Her eyes flicked up, landing on the hoodie, the denim, and then inevitably his face. A micro-pause followed. It was a hesitation Arthur had catalogued 1,000 times in 1,000 different rooms, the subconscious recalibration of expectations, the silent, instantaneous audit of his presence. She handed the phone back, her voice dropping a fraction in warmth compared to the previous passenger. He nodded, a gesture of practiced neutrality, and walked down the jet bridge. The air grew cooler, carrying the distinct sterile scent of aviation fuel, recycled ozone, and impending altitude. The transition from the terminal to the aircraft was a physical threshold, a crossing into a suspended reality where the rules of gravity and society were compressed into a metal cylinder. Stepping onto the plane, the first-class cabin revealed itself as a sanctuary of curated privilege. Ambient amber lighting washed over the wide leather seats, casting a warm, exclusionary glow. The flight attendant positioned at the bulkhead was a study in aggressive hospitality. Her name tag, pinned with mathematical precision to her navy blazer, read Barbara. She possessed the kind of rigid, sprayed-in-place blonde hair and practiced smile that suggested decades of navigating the volatile egos of frequent flyers. She greeted the businessmen ahead of Arthur with a practiced melodic trill, taking his coat like it was a religious artifact, carefully draping it over a velvet hanger. Arthur stepped into the cabin. He stopped at row 2, turning to slide his messenger bag under the seat of 1A. The space was generous, designed to insulate its occupant from the indignities of commercial travel. As he settled into the rich, caramel-colored leather of 2A, he exhaled, the tension of the impending acquisition momentarily receding. He opened his laptop, the screen illuminating his face, and began reviewing the final term sheets for the Atlanta deal. Barbara moved down the aisle, a silver tray of pre-departure beverages balanced perfectly in her manicured hand. Crystal flutes of champagne caught the amber light, tiny bubbles rushing toward the surface. She stopped at row 1, offering a glass to a woman draped in beige cashmere. The exchange was wrapped in quiet pleasantries, a mutual reinforcement of status. She stepped back, pivoting gracefully. Her gaze swept over row 2. The smile remained, but the warmth vanished, replaced by a sudden, impenetrable opacity. Her eyes registered Arthur, processed the hoodie, the dark skin, the quiet demeanor, and immediately dismissed the data as an anomaly not worth her service. She turned her back, the silver tray rotating away from his airspace, and proceeded to row 3. Arthur watched the crisp seam of her navy blazer retreat. The omission was not an accident. It was a choice, a deliberate editing of her reality. He did not call out. He did not wave his hand. Power, he had learned long ago, never begged to be acknowledged. It simply waited. He returned his attention to the glowing screen, the complex financial models charting the future of the very airline whose employee had just rendered him invisible. The irony was a bitter, familiar taste. The boarding process dragged on, a slow parade of economy passengers shuffling past the velvet rope of the first-class cabin. Each person carried the exhausted resignation of modern travel, their eyes briefly lingering on the wide seats and half-empty champagne flutes before being herded toward the back. Arthur kept his gaze fixed on his work, though his peripheral vision caught the subtle shifts in the cabin's atmosphere. Across the aisle in seat 2C sat a young man with a chaotic mop of dark hair and a heavily stickered laptop. Lucas. He was adjusting a small camera mounted on a flexible tripod attached to his tray table, muttering under his breath about lighting angles. He was the kind of tech-adjacent chronicler who viewed every moment of existence as potential content. Arthur noted the camera, a small blinking red eye of objective reality in a space built on subjective privilege. To Arthur's immediate right, in seat 1B, the atmosphere thickened. William Bradley arrived. He was a man who took up space not just physically but atmospherically. His silver hair was perfectly coiffed, his face flushed with the ruddy complexion of expensive scotch and unchecked hypertension. He wore a bespoke suit that screamed of aggressive litigation and country club dominance. He tossed a heavy leather briefcase into the overhead bin with a reckless disregard for the surrounding bags, slamming the compartment shut with a concussive thud. Bradley barked a command toward the galley, his voice carrying a tone of proprietary familiarity, demanding a double pour of premium scotch. Barbara materialized instantly, her professional veneer replaced by an eager, almost subservient warmth, assuring him the catering had been specially verified for his preferences. The aircraft doors closed with a heavy pneumatic seal. The finality of the sound reverberated through the cabin. The transition was complete. They were now a closed ecosystem bound by the physical limits of the fuselage and the psychological limits of the crew. The engines whined, a low vibration that built into a steady, powerful roar. As the plane pushed back from the gate, Arthur closed his laptop. He closed his eyes, visualizing the boardroom in Atlanta. The faces of the executives he was about to displace, the systematic restructuring he had spent 18 months designing, the legacy he was building brick by painful brick. The ascent was steep and turbulent, the plane punching through a dense layer of Midwestern clouds before breaking out into the brilliant, blinding blue of the upper atmosphere. The seatbelt sign chimed off, a twin electronic ping that signaled the beginning of the in-flight service choreography. The smell of warmed, mixed nuts and roasting meat began to filter through the cabin. The first-class meal service was a carefully orchestrated performance designed to simulate a high-end restaurant at 35,000 feet. Barbara emerged from the forward galley pushing a polished metal cart. She began at row 1. William Bradley received his scotch and a steaming porcelain plate of braised short rib. The interaction was a flurry of practiced deference. Barbara moved to the young woman in 1A, presenting a delicately plated salmon. The cart rolled back. The wheels clicked softly against the carpet. It stopped parallel to row 2. Arthur lowered his tray table. He was hungry, having skipped breakfast to review the final legal addendums of the acquisition. He looked up, his expression neutral, ready to state his preference. Barbara's hands gripped the handle of the cart. She did not look at his face. Her eyes remained fixed on the space slightly to the left of his shoulder. She reached down into the lower compartment of the cart, bypassing the heated porcelain plates and crystal glassware. Her hand emerged holding a plastic-wrapped object. She dropped it onto Arthur's tray table. The sound was a sharp synthetic slap against the faux wood. It was a prepackaged turkey sandwich, the kind sold in the economy cabin for a handful of crumpled bills. Condensation clung to the inside of the plastic, blurring the pale, unappetizing contents. Beside it, she placed a small, warm bottle of generic water. The cabin's ambient hum seemed to drop by a decibel. Arthur looked at the plastic-wrapped sandwich, then slowly raised his gaze to meet hers. For the first time, she looked directly at him. Her eyes were hard, flat discs of unyielding prejudice. There was no apology in her posture, no pretense of a mistake. It was a calculated delivery of a message. "I believe there has been a mistake." His voice was low, smooth, devoid of the anger she was clearly expecting. It was the voice of a man who evaluated problems, not a man who reacted to them. "This is not the meal service standard for this cabin." Barbara's smile was a thin, cruel laceration across her face. "We are entirely out of the premium entrees." Arthur gestured to the lower racks of the cart, clearly visible from his vantage point. 3 untouched porcelain plates of short rib sat warming under their cloches. "I can see 3 remaining meals right there." The thin smile did not waver. It calcified. She leaned in slightly, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial, venomous register, meant only for his airspace. "Those are reserved for our priority passengers. This is all we have available for you. It's a perfectly fine sandwich." She paused, the silence stretching taut. "That's what people like you eat anyway, isn't it?" The words hung in the pressurized air. A precise surgical strike. It was not a microaggression. It was a macro-assault, delivered with the casual brutality of someone who believed she operated with absolute impunity. Arthur did not flinch. He did not raise his voice. Anger was a luxury of the powerless. The powerful required cold, calculating stillness. He leaned back in his seat, leaving the sandwich exactly where she had dropped it. "I paid full price for this seat. I expect the service that accompanies the fare." Barbara's posture snapped rigid. The facade of the flight attendant vanished, replaced by the furious entitlement of a gatekeeper challenged by an interloper. "I have told you what is available. I strongly suggest you accept it and keep your voice down, sir. We do not tolerate disruptive behavior on this aircraft." She turned her back to him, shoving the cart forward with unnecessary force, moving on to row 3. Across the aisle, Lucas had stopped typing. His eyes were wide, darting between Arthur's stoic profile and Barbara's retreating back. The small red light on his camera was blinking steadily. He reached out, his fingers trembling slightly, and angled the lens to capture a clear shot of the plastic-wrapped sandwich sitting on the polished tray table. Arthur closed his eyes. The adrenaline spiked in his bloodstream, a hot, primal surge demanding reaction. He forced it down, breathing through his nose, anchoring himself to the weight of the handkerchief in his pocket. Control, that was the doctrine. They wanted him to explode. They wanted the stereotype. They wanted the angry black man, loud and unpredictable, so they could justify the police, the handcuffs, the structural violence they were dying to unleash. He would not give them the satisfaction. He would give them a mirror. 10 minutes passed. The cabin was suspended in a tense, uncomfortable quiet. The clinking of silverware against porcelain from the surrounding seats sounded unnaturally loud, a chorus of consumption that actively excluded him. Then the dynamic shifted. William Bradley, having finished his short rib and drained his scotch, suddenly pushed himself up from his seat in 1B. His face was flushed, his movements heavy and uncoordinated. He turned around, leaning heavily against the bulkhead, his gaze locking onto Arthur. Bradley's eyes narrowed, scanning the hoodie, the dark skin, the untouched, sweating sandwich on the tray table. A look of profound distaste twisted his features. It was the look of a man who had paid a premium specifically to avoid reality, only to find it sitting in row 2. He snapped his fingers, a sharp, cracking sound that cut through the engine drone, demanding Barbara's immediate presence. Barbara appeared from the forward galley with alarming speed, her expression instantly molding into fawning concern. Bradley gestured toward Arthur with a thick, heavy hand. "I have a highly sensitive medical condition. Hypertension. Stress aggravates it." He pitched his voice loud enough for the entire cabin to hear. A performance of victimization. "I cannot relax. I cannot breathe properly with this individual sitting directly behind me. He's staring at me. He's making me incredibly uncomfortable." Arthur had been looking at his blank laptop screen. He slowly turned his head, his gaze meeting Bradley's. The lie was so brazen, so absurdly constructed, it bordered on farce. But Arthur knew the architecture of this specific play. It was the weaponization of white fragility. Barbara did not hesitate. She did not assess the situation. She did not ask Arthur a single question. She pivoted toward Arthur, her face a mask of stern, uncompromising authority. She had found her ally, her justification. "Sir?" Her voice was loud, clipped, designed to draw the attention of the entire cabin. "You are making our VIP passenger uncomfortable. You need to gather your belongings." Arthur remained perfectly still. The air in the cabin grew dense, suffocating. "I am sitting quietly in my assigned seat. I have not spoken to this man. I have not looked at this man." "That is not what Mr. Bradley says." Barbara crossed her arms over her chest. "Mr. Bradley is a Diamond Medallion member. His comfort is our absolute priority. Furthermore, you have already been combative regarding the meal service. You are creating a hostile environment." Bradley nodded vigorously, emboldened by the institutional backing, demanding Arthur be sent to the back of the aircraft. "There is a middle seat available in row 26. Barbara stated, her tone final. "You will move there immediately or we will have a serious problem." Arthur looked at Barbara. He looked at Bradley. He looked at the system operating exactly as it was designed to operate, a closed loop of bias, reinforcing itself, protecting its own. "I am not moving." His voice was a low, resonant baritone, vibrating with absolute certainty. "I hold a confirmed ticket for seat 2A. I have broken no rules. I will not be relocated to economy because this man has manufactured a complaint to satisfy his own prejudice." Barbara's face flushed a deep, mottled red. The defiance was intolerable to her. "You do not dictate the rules on this aircraft. You are now officially refusing a direct crew member instruction. That is a federal offense. A crew member instruction must be lawful and rooted in safety." Arthur's knowledge of aviation law was encyclopedic, a byproduct of his impending acquisition. Relocating a paying passenger to satisfy another passenger's racial discomfort is neither. Bradley stepped forward, leaning over Arthur's seat, his scotch-soaked breath hot and aggressive. Who the hell do you think you are? You don't belong here. Look at yourself. Move your ass to the back before I move it for you. Do not touch me. Arthur's voice did not rise in volume, but the density of the warning was unmistakable. It was a verbal wall of steel. Bradley recoiled slightly, startled by the sheer force of the quiet command. He turned to Barbara, his face purple with rage, demanding the captain be brought out immediately. Barbara snatched the interphone receiver from the bulkhead wall, her fingers punching the buttons with frantic, aggressive energy. She spoke in hushed, urgent tones, her eyes locked on Arthur. She was constructing the narrative, the combative passenger, the threat to safety, the hostile presence. Lucas was no longer pretending to work. He had unclipped the camera from the tripod and was holding it at chest level, both hands steadying the frame. The lens was capturing every micro-expression, every aggressive lean from Bradley, every stoic blink from Arthur. Other passengers were sinking lower into their seats, the bystander effect paralyzing the cabin. Eyes averted, headphones suddenly secured tight, the collective decision to see nothing, to hear nothing, to do nothing. The heavy reinforced door of the cockpit clicked open. Captain Richard Collins stepped into the cabin. He was a large man, barrel-chested, his silver hair cropped in a severe military fade. His uniform was immaculate, 4 gold stripes gleaming on his epaulets. He moved with the heavy, unyielding momentum of a man who had never been told no in his adult life. He was not here to investigate, he was here to enforce. Collins stopped beside row 2. He looked at Barbara, then at Bradley, and finally he looked down at Arthur. The hierarchy was instantly established. The white flight attendant, the white VIP, the black passenger. Collins's mind processed the visual data and arrived at the predetermined conclusion before a single word was spoken. His deep, gravelly voice rumbled through the cabin, demanding an explanation from his crew. Barbara's voice shook with manufactured adrenaline as she accused Arthur of hostility, disrupting the meal service and actively threatening the VIP passenger. Bradley chimed in, his tone dripping with aggrieved entitlement, doubling down on the fabricated physical threat. Collins did not ask Arthur for his version of events. He did not look for witnesses. He squared his broad shoulders, looming over seat 2A, effectively blocking the aisle. Listen to me very carefully, son. Collins used the diminutive with calculated disrespect. On my aircraft, I am the law. What I say goes. My crew has instructed you to move. You are currently in violation of federal regulations. You will unbuckle your seatbelt, gather your bag, and move to row 26 immediately. If you do not, I will consider you a threat to the safety of this flight, and I will have you removed. Arthur looked up at the gold stripes on the man's shoulders. He saw the rot in the foundation of his own impending empire. This was what he was buying, a culture built on the casual destruction of dignity. Captain Collins. Arthur read the name tag. I strongly suggest you speak to the other passengers in this cabin before you make a decision that will end your career. I have not raised my voice. I have made no threats. I am being subjected to discriminatory harassment by your crew and this passenger. Collins's face darkened. The calm articulation of rights was deeply offensive to his authority. I don't care who you think you are or what kind of attitude you brought on board today. I am giving you a lawful order. You have exactly 30 seconds to comply before I call in security. I am not moving. It was the final boundary, the absolute refusal to submit. Collins turned his head sharply toward the rear of the first-class cabin, calling for the air marshal to execute a level 2 restraint and relocation. From row 4, a man who had appeared to be sleeping suddenly stood up. He was built like a cinder block, wearing a nondescript polo shirt and tactical trousers. Officer Davis. He moved down the aisle with terrifying, practiced efficiency. There was no hesitation, no assessment of the threat. The captain had given the order. The machinery of state violence was now in motion. Davis reached Arthur's seat, commanding him to stand with his hands visible. Arthur unbuckled his seatbelt. He moved slowly, deliberately, keeping his hands visible, flat on the armrests. He was hyper-aware of the danger. A sudden movement, a twitch, a perceived flinch. Any of it could be the excuse they needed to escalate from restraint to lethal force. "I am complying," Arthur stated, his voice steady, though his heart hammered a heavy, brutal rhythm against his ribs. "I am standing up." As Arthur rose, Davis lunged. It was an excessive, completely unnecessary maneuver. Davis grabbed Arthur's left wrist, twisting it violently behind his back. The pain was immediate and blinding, a sharp, tearing sensation in the rotator cuff. Davis screamed for him to stop resisting, utilizing the theater of compliance to justify the violence already being applied. "I am not resisting. You are hurting my shoulder." Davis ignored him. With his free hand, he shoved Arthur forward. Arthur lost his balance, pitching toward the bulkhead. His head collided with the sharp, molded plastic edge of the tray table console in row 1. A sickening crack echoed in the cabin. Pain exploded behind Arthur's eyes, a brilliant white flash that momentarily blinded him. He tasted copper in the back of his throat. A warm, thick liquid began to slide down his temple, tracing a jagged line across his cheekbone. Gasps erupted from the cabin. The bystander paralysis shattered. Several people stood up. Half a dozen smartphones were suddenly raised, lenses focused on the violence. Lucas was standing in the aisle, his camera mere feet away, capturing the blood, the twisted arm, the sheer, undeniable brutality of the moment. He yelled out in defense, his voice cracking with panic, insisting Arthur had done nothing wrong. Davis bellowed at the cabin to return to their seats under threat of arrest, his face red with exertion. He slammed Arthur against the bulkhead wall, pinning him with his heavy body weight. The cold, heavy metal of tactical handcuffs bit into Arthur's wrists. Davis ratcheted them down with savage force. The plastic teeth clicked rapidly, locking tighter and tighter until the metal sheared into Arthur's skin, instantly cutting off the circulation to his hands. Fire shot up Arthur's forearms. His fingers began to tingle, then rapidly numb. "The cuffs are too tight," he gasped, his breath hitching as the pain localized into a burning agony. "You're cutting off my circulation." Davis grabbed the chain connecting the cuffs and yanked upward, using the leverage to bend Arthur forward at a painful, unnatural angle, ordering him to shut up. Collins stood by, watching the blood drip from Arthur's chin onto the pristine blue carpet. There was no pity in the captain's eyes, only the grim satisfaction of order being brutally restored. Barbara stood behind him, a hand pressed to her chest, her eyes wide, performing horror while securing her victory. Bradley had retreated to his seat, looking slightly pale but vindicated. Collins ordered the marshal to secure Arthur to the jump seat in the aft galley. Davis yanked the chain. "Move!" Arthur stumbled. The world spun dizzily, the edges of his vision blurring with black spots. The blow to his head was severe. Blood soaked into the collar of the cashmere hoodie, staining the fine fabric a rusty, dark brown. He found his footing, forcing his legs to support his weight. He was dragged down the aisle. It was a procession of absolute humiliation. Through the first-class cabin, past the horrified faces of the corporate elite who had remained silent. Through the heavy curtain, into the economy cabin. 180 faces turned toward him. 180 pairs of eyes watched a bleeding, handcuffed black man being marched down the narrow aisle by a federal agent. Phones were held aloft, a gauntlet of recording devices capturing the destruction of his dignity. The flashes of cameras strobed in the dim cabin light, illuminating the blood on his face, the unnatural twist of his arms, the sheer, raw injustice of the spectacle. The silence in the economy cabin was absolute, save for the heavy breathing of the marshal and the shuffle of Arthur's sneakers. No one spoke. No one intervened. It was the terrifying, complicit silence of a society watching a lynching in modern dress. Arthur kept his head up. His vision swam, the pain in his wrists a screaming siren in his brain, but he refused to bow his head. He looked into the lenses of the phones. He let them record the blood. He let them record the cuffs. He was compiling the ledger, every drop of blood, every click of the ratcheting metal, every silent passenger. It was all being entered into an account that he would balance with devastating precision. They reached the aft galley. It was a tight metallic space smelling of stale coffee and industrial cleaner. Davis shoved Arthur's into the rigid metal jump seat, grabbing a heavy nylon restraint strap from the bulkhead and weaving it through Arthur's handcuffed arms, securing him tightly to the frame of the aircraft. Davis ordered him to remain perfectly still and silent, his breath coming in heavy, exhausted pants. Arthur leaned his head back against the cold metal bulkhead. The cut on his temple throbbed with a rhythmic, pulsing agony. His hands were completely numb, the flesh around the cuffs turning a bruised, mottled purple. He closed his eyes, drawing a slow, agonizing breath into his lungs. He felt the shape of the handkerchief in his front pocket, pressed hard against his thigh by the nylon restraint. He thought of his mother. He thought of the 40 years of silent endurance, the indignities swallowed, the polite smiles given to cruel people. He opened his eyes. The galley was empty save for him. The curtain to the main cabin was drawn shut. He was isolated, detained, bleeding. But he was not powerless. The mechanical thrum of the Boeing 737's twin turbofan engines vibrated directly through the aluminum floor grates of the aft galley, traveling up through the soles of Arthur's unbranded leather sneakers. It was a relentless, grinding frequency that mirrored the throbbing in his skull. The aft galley was a claustrophobic cylinder of brushed steel, warning placards, and the sharp, antiseptic odor of industrial aviation cleaner. Harsh fluorescent light spilled from the ceiling panels, illuminating the smeared droplets of crimson tracking across the white linoleum. The blood originating from the deep laceration on his temple had slowed to a viscous, heavy crawl, charting a hot path down his jawline before soaking into the collar of his navy Loro Piana cashmere hoodie. Every pulse of his heart was a localized drumbeat of agony. The tactical plastic restraints encasing his wrists were not designed for temporary restraint. They were engineered to inflict absolute compliance through escalating suffering. The serrated edges dug mercilessly into the swelling tissue of his forearms, the circulation entirely severed. His hands had long passed the sensation of screaming fire, transitioning into a heavy, terrifying, and profound numbness. Officer Davis occupied the narrow space 2 feet away, standing with the aggressive, wide-legged stance of a man who drew oxygen entirely from physical intimidation. The air marshal's broad chest heaved slightly beneath his tactical polo shirt, adrenaline still flooding his bloodstream from the violent takedown. He watched Arthur with a toxic mixture of practiced law enforcement detachment and lingering, visceral hostility. His right hand resting casually against the heavy black retention holster on his duty belt. A thick nylon restraint strap bound Arthur's chest tightly to the jump seat's reinforced titanium frame, restricting his lung capacity to shallow, inadequate, and painful gasps. Arthur closed his eyes, systematically isolating the pain, compartmentalizing the burning in his rotator cuffs and the sharp throbbing at his skull. Panic was a highly corrosive acid. It destroyed strategic clarity. He required absolute crystalline focus. The parameters of the operation had violently shifted. This was no longer a real estate and infrastructure acquisition scheduled for a boardroom in Atlanta. The battlefield had condensed entirely to this metallic tube hurtling through the frozen stratosphere at 500 miles per hour. He inhaled slowly, expanding his ribcage against the unforgiving nylon strap until the fibers groaned. Federal Aviation Protocol, specifically Title 49 of the United States Code governing the detainment of passengers under suspicion of crew interference, mandates immediate communication with legal counsel once the subject is secured and poses no active flight risk. The baritone of his voice was startlingly steady, cutting straight through the ambient drone of the jet engines and the hissing air vents. It lacked the frantic, elevated pitch of a victim. Davis shifted his considerable weight, crossing his thick, muscular arms over his chest. "You do not dictate federal protocol to me. You sit there, you keep your mouth shut, and you wait until we touch down and local law enforcement drags you off this aircraft." Section 44,902 clearly outlines the liability parameters regarding the deprivation of civil rights under color of law. Arthur opened his eyes, leveling a gaze of terrifying, unblinking intensity directly at the marshal. "I am securely restrained to a structural bulkhead. I am unarmed. I require my mobile device, which is currently located in the front pocket of my messenger bag in row 2. Now." The absolute lack of fear in Arthur's dark eyes deeply unsettled Davis. The marshal was entirely accustomed to tears, to desperate, stammering pleas, to drunken, uncoordinated rage. He was profoundly unequipped for cold, legalistic precision delivered by a bleeding man shackled to a galley wall. A microscopic flicker of uncertainty passed over the law enforcement officer's hardened face, a sudden hairline crack in the foundation of his absolute authority. "I am not walking all the way up to first class to fetch your toys. If you deny this explicit request, you are willfully violating federal detainment statutes. The moment the landing gear touches the tarmac, the immediate legal liability will shift entirely from a localized airline disturbance to a federal civil rights deprivation lawsuit targeting you personally, stripping you of qualified immunity." Arthur leaned the back of his head against the cold aluminum paneling, letting the heavy, precise words hang suspended in the pressurized air. "A choice is currently in front of you. Choose very carefully." True, unassailable power never begs. It simply outlines the inevitable, crushing consequences of failure. Davis stared at him for a long, heavy, suffocating moment. The deeply ingrained machinery of bureaucratic self-preservation began to grind loudly in the marshal's mind. He unclipped a heavy black two-way radio from his tactical shoulder strap, keying the microphone with a thick thumb. Static hissed violently through the small speaker. "Captain, I have the disruptive subject fully secured in the aft jump seat. He is currently demanding access to his cellular device to contact legal counsel, requesting operational guidance." The radio crackled back almost instantly, Captain Richard Collins's voice distorted by the frequency but dripping with undeniable, arrogant contempt. "Let him make his little phone call, Davis. He can cry to whatever strip mall injury lawyer he wants. It will not change the reception committee of airport police waiting for him at the arrival gate. Bring the man his bag." 10 agonizing minutes later, the vintage weathered leather messenger bag was dropped unceremoniously onto Arthur's lap. The heavy nylon chest strap was loosened just enough by Davis to allow Arthur to manipulate the brass zipper with his numb, purpling, unresponsive fingers, though his wrists remained fiercely bound together behind his back in a contorted angle. Every microscopic movement tore at the damaged muscle tissue in his shoulders. He forced his deadened fingertips deep into the front leather pocket, retrieving a matte black smartphone. It was not a standard consumer cellular device. It was a military-grade encrypted satellite terminal, capable of penetrating the thickest corporate and logistical firewalls on the planet. Arthur bypassed the standard commercial cellular network entirely. He initiated a secure, prioritized uplink directly to a private server. The high-resolution screen glowed brightly, throwing harsh, angular shadows across his blood-stained cheekbones. He punched in a 10-digit sequence he had memorized for absolute worst-case emergencies. The secure line connected on the half-ring. "Hayes!" The voice on the other end was sharp, impatient, belonging to an older man deeply accustomed to managing global geopolitical crises before his morning coffee. It was Senator Thomas Sterling, the current chairman of the board for the airline's massive parent conglomerate. "Thomas, We have a severe catastrophic operational malfunction on Flight 882, currently en route out of Chicago. Arthur's voice was stripped of all conversational warmth, devoid of any social pleasantries. It was the precise, chilling tone of an apex predator coordinating a targeted strike. Arthur, you sound strange. Are you currently in the air? The Atlanta acquisition isn't scheduled to formally close for another 3 hours. Where are you? The Atlanta deal is suspended indefinitely. I am currently shackled to the aft bulkhead of one of your Boeing 737s. I have been physically assaulted by a federal air marshal acting under the direct unlawful orders of your captain. I am actively bleeding from a head wound sustained during the restraint. Your flight crew explicitly denied me basic service, weaponized a completely fabricated complaint from a white VIP passenger, and authorized excessive punitive force to remove me from my purchased seat. Silence rapidly expanded on the encrypted channel. It was not the brief silence of disbelief, but the horrifying, absolute, suffocating silence of a powerful man watching a billion-dollar corporate empire step blindly onto a buried landmine. Are you telling me my flight crew just physically assaulted the majority shareholder of this airline? Sterling's voice had dropped to a hoarse, trembling whisper. I am telling you that the systemic rot embedded within your customer service and security protocols has just collided head-on with the one passenger on this planet who possesses the liquid capital and the absolute will to dismantle it. Arthur tasted the sharp metallic tang of fresh blood slipping past his lips. Initiate priority override Alpha. Ground this aircraft, turn it around immediately, have a federal enforcement team from the Department of Justice and our entire corporate legal division waiting on the tarmac at O'Hare. Nobody leaves this plane. Arthur, the logistical implications of a forced turnaround over crowded airspace. Ground the plane, Thomas, now! Arthur ended the call with a single press of his thumb. He let the heavy black device slide from his numb fingers back into the open maw of the leather bag. He closed his eyes again, entirely ignoring the incredulous, mocking scoff emanating from Officer Davis, who had only heard half the conversation and immediately assumed it was a pathetic, theatrical bluff designed to save face. In the reinforced cockpit, 35,000 feet above the sprawling, geometric farmlands of the Indiana border, the serene tranquility of the cruise phase was violently and permanently shattered. Captain Richard Collins was casually reviewing the descent trajectory matrix for Atlanta, a styrofoam cup of lukewarm black coffee resting comfortably in the console cup holder. He was basking in the deep, profoundly satisfying internal glow of a man who had successfully excised an irritation from his absolute domain. The system had worked flawlessly, order had been aggressively maintained, the hierarchy remained intact. The primary radio channel suddenly shrieked with an emergency override tone. It was a piercing, dissonant sound Collins had only ever heard in computerized simulator training, a restricted frequency reserved exclusively for catastrophic mechanical failures, hijackings, or immediate national security threats. Flight 882. This is Chicago Center. Immediate mandatory instruction. You are ordered to halt your current trajectory, bank hard left to heading 340, and return to O'Hare International immediately. Acknowledge this instruction. Collins froze completely, his hand hovering rigidly over the glowing autopilot console. He exchanged a bewildered, terrified, wide-eyed glance with his first officer. Chicago Center, this is 882. We have absolutely no mechanical emergencies on board. We are currently proceeding to Atlanta on schedule. Please verify your diversion instruction. Negative, 882. This is a Tier 1 corporate and federal command override originating directly from the chairman of the board, authenticated by the FAA Director of Security. You are to return to O'Hare immediately. A secure, isolated tarmac location has been cleared for your arrival. You are explicitly instructed not to communicate the nature of this diversion to the passengers until final approach. Do you copy, 882? The blood instantly drained from Collins's face, leaving his ruddy, confident complexion a sickly, chalky, translucent gray. A Tier 1 corporate override. It was a mythological protocol whispered about in break rooms. It meant the people who signed his substantial paychecks, the untouchable entities who owned the very air he was currently breathing, had forcefully seized control of his aircraft from the ground. Copy Chicago Center. Banking to heading 340. Returning to O'Hare. Collins reached out and violently disengaged the autopilot. He grabbed the heavy yoke, his hands suddenly slick with cold, terrified sweat. The invincible protective armor of his uniform felt instantly suffocating. He banked the massive commercial aircraft hard to the left, pulling back slightly to maintain altitude through the aggressive maneuver. The physical reality of the sudden turnaround slammed violently into the passenger cabin. In first class, William Bradley's second heavy glass of premium scotch toppled over, amber liquid cascading off the tray table and soaking deep into his expensive worsted wool trousers. He cursed loudly, his face flushing crimson as he grabbed the leather armrests, the aggressive G-force pressing his heavy frame deep into the seat cushions. Barbara Jenkins stumbled badly in the forward galley, losing her footing entirely and dropping a tall stack of clear plastic cups that clattered loudly and chaotically across the floor. Lucas, sitting in seat 2C, immediately pulled up the live flight tracker application on his stickered laptop. The digital green icon of Flight 882, which had previously been drawing a straight, confident line toward the state of Georgia, was now carving a sharp, aggressive red U-turn back over the American Midwest. The young tech blogger aimed his camera lens directly at the glowing screen, zooming in tightly on the undeniable empirical geographic data. The aircraft was retreating. In the aft galley, the violent left bank threw Arthur heavily against the tight nylon straps. The damaged tissue in his shoulder flared into a blinding, white-hot crescendo of pain, but a grim, cold, absolute satisfaction settled deep in his chest. The Leviathan was turning around. Davis braced himself desperately against the aluminum bulkheads, his eyes widening in sudden, uncomprehending panic. "What the hell is he doing up there? We're turning." Arthur did not turn his head to look at him. The engine pitch changed dramatically. A deeper, throaty, straining roar as the massive aircraft fought its own forward momentum. "The destination coordinates have been updated, Officer Davis. You should seriously prepare yourself for the arrival." 40 agonizing, turbulent minutes later, the jagged, iconic Chicago skyline breached the dense, low-hanging cloud cover. The descent was rapid and punishing. A steep, aggressive dive that left ears popping painfully and stomachs dropping into the floorboards. The main cabin was entirely engulfed in a terrified, confused, anxious murmur. Collins finally keyed the public address intercom, his voice completely stripped of all its former booming patriarchal authority. It sounded thin, reedy, and profoundly defeated. "Ladies and gentlemen, due to an unforeseen critical security mandate from the ground, we have been diverted back to Chicago O'Hare. Please remain securely in your seats with your seatbelts fastened." The heavy landing gear deployed with a violent, mechanical thud that reverberated through the fuselage. The aircraft hit the wet tarmac at O'Hare with a brutal, jarring impact, the massive thrust reversers screaming in protest as Collins slammed on the carbon brakes. They did not taxi toward the brightly lit, bustling gates of Concourse B. The plane rolled slowly toward a remote, isolated, desolate stretch of cracked concrete miles away from the main terminals, a dead zone usually reserved strictly for hijacked flights, bomb threats, or severe biological hazard containment. Through the small, scratch-marred porthole window embedded in the aft exit door, Arthur watched the reception committee slowly materialize from the gray, freezing morning fog. It was a staggering, overwhelming display of institutional and corporate force. 6 black, heavily armored Chevrolet Suburbans formed a tight, inescapable perimeter around the final parking coordinates. Blinding red and blue strobe lights slashed through the dense mist, reflecting sharply off the rain-slicked tarmac. Dozens of men and women wearing dark waterproof windbreakers bearing the bright yellow, unmistakable letters of the FBI and the FAA swarmed the immediate area. Standing directly behind the tactical perimeter stood a grim contingent of men in immaculate $1,000 bespoke suits, the absolute vanguard of Vance Capital's ruthless legal destruction unit. The jet engines spun down into a high-pitched, dying whine, then fell completely silent. The auxiliary power unit kicked on beneath the tail, a low, buzzing hum that entirely failed to mask the absolute, breathless, terrifying silence expanding inside the aircraft. Heavy, aggressive, rhythmic knocks pounded violently against the exterior of the forward boarding door. The electronic locking mechanism clicked sharply. The heavy door was hauled open from the outside, letting in a blast of freezing Chicago air. This was not local airport police. This was not private airline security. A wave of highly trained federal agents poured aggressively into the forward galley. They completely bypassed Barbara, who was currently hyperventilating against the beverage cart, her trembling hands pressed hard to her mouth in sheer, unadulterated terror. They bypassed Collins, who had emerged slowly from the cockpit looking exactly like a ghost haunting the ruins of his own life. The lead federal agent, a broad-shouldered man with a severe military buzz cut and a gold DOJ badge clipped prominently to his belt, marched straight down the main aisle. His hard eyes scanned the terrified faces in the cabin until he reached the heavy blue curtain separating first class from economy. He ripped it open with a violent swipe of his arm. He found Arthur tied to the jump seat, dark blood crusted heavily on his face, his hands a swollen deep purple behind his back. The agent's face hardened into a mask of pure professional fury. He pointed directly at the chest of Officer Davis. "Step away from the passenger. Move your hands away from your weapon. Do it right now." Davis was completely paralyzed, his brain critically failing to process the rapid, catastrophic, logic-defying shift in his reality. "I am a sworn federal air marshal. This subject is currently detained for interfering with a... You are currently under federal arrest for the deprivation of civil rights under color of law and aggravated assault." The FBI agent did not yell. He delivered the devastating facts with crushing, inescapable bureaucratic weight. Two other heavily armed agents flanked Davis instantly, violently stripping his service weapon from its holster and slamming him face first against the very same aluminum bulkhead where he had pinned Arthur an hour earlier. The sharp metallic click of steel handcuffs echoed loudly in the galley. It was the distinct, satisfying sound of an apex predator instantly becoming prey. A tall man in a sharp, perfectly tailored charcoal gray suit pushed his way past the perimeter of federal agents. It was David Cohen, Vance Capital's lead corporate litigator and Arthur's most trusted legal strategist. He held a small, specialized pair of heavy-duty trauma shears. He knelt quickly beside Arthur, his hands moving with rapid, practiced efficiency. "Arthur, I am so incredibly sorry we didn't intercept this before you left the ground." The thick plastic cuffs were cleanly cut. The heavy metal ratchets holding them together were violently disengaged and tossed onto the floor. The sudden, unobstructed rush of oxygenated blood back into Arthur's hands was a highly specific, excruciating kind of agony. Feeling exactly like thousands of microscopic, burning needles firing all at once beneath his skin. He hissed sharply through his teeth, pulling his stiff arms forward, gently cradling his swollen, damaged wrists against his chest. The thick nylon strap binding his torso fell away, pooling on the floor. He was free. He stood up. His legs were noticeably shaky, the massive adrenaline crash threatening to pull him under into unconsciousness, but he locked his knees with sheer, uncompromising willpower. He reached slowly down into his vintage messenger bag, pulling out a meticulously folded bespoke suit jacket, the impenetrable corporate armor he had intended to wear into the high-stakes boardroom in Atlanta. He slipped the immaculate jacket on directly over the blood-stained, ruined cashmere hoodie. The visual contrast was stark, terrifying, and profoundly deliberate. He was the undeniable bleeding victim of systemic, unchecked brutality, wrapped securely in the undeniable, untouchable mantle of elite corporate power. "Bring me the portfolio," Arthur commanded, his voice raspy, damaged, but rapidly gaining strength and terrifying volume. Cohen immediately handed him a heavy, thick leather folder, the front deeply embossed with the gold crest of Vance Capital. Arthur turned away from the aft galley. He walked slowly, deliberately back up the long, narrow aisle. He walked past the staring, terrified, wide eyes of the 180 economy passengers who had sat in absolute silence and watched him bleed. He pushed through the heavy blue curtain, stepping back into the amber glow of first class. The air in the premium cabin was entirely stagnant, choked with raw fear and the smell of spilled alcohol. William Bradley was pressed deep into the leather of seat 1B, his face pale and sweating profusely, the aggressive entitlement completely evaporated from his demeanor. Barbara was backed flush against the forward lavatory door, shaking uncontrollably, tears streaking her perfectly applied makeup. Captain Collins stood near the open cockpit entrance, tightly flanked by 2 federal agents, his posture utterly defeated. Arthur stopped dead in the exact center of the first-class aisle. The dried blood on his face was a vivid, undeniable testament to their collective racist actions. He held the heavy leather portfolio in his bruised, swollen hands. He looked directly at Barbara, whose eyes darted wildly around the enclosed space, desperately searching for an escape hatch that fundamentally did not exist. He looked at Bradley, the insecure, fragile architect of the initial lie. Finally, his dark, unyielding gaze locked onto Captain Collins. "You demanded absolute compliance, Captain." Arthur's voice filled the quiet cabin, a resonant, inescapable truth that left no room for debate. "You explicitly stated that on this aircraft you are the law. You made a fundamental, catastrophic miscalculation." Arthur opened the heavy leather portfolio. He withdrew a thick stack of pristine legal documents, the top page bearing the unmistakable, brightly colored seals of federal regulatory approval and massive corporate asset transfer. He dropped the heavy stack of paper onto the polished mahogany bulkhead counter. The sound was as sharp and final as a gunshot. "My name is Arthur Hayes." He let the name hang suspended there in the pressurized air. He watched the horrifying realization slowly detonate behind Collins's tired eyes. He watched the absolute life-altering ruin dawn completely on Barbara's tear-streaked face. "At exactly 0600 hours this morning, my firm legally finalized the acquisition of a 34% controlling stake in this airline's parent conglomerate. I hold absolute veto power over the entire board of directors. I control the operational budget. I control the corporate pensions." Arthur took one slow, deliberate step closer to the captain, the physical distance between them evaporating into nothing. "You are not the law on this aircraft, Richard. You are my employee. And as of this exact second, your employment and the employment of this flight attendant is permanently and irrevocably terminated. Justice delayed is not justice denied if the hammer falls hard enough to completely shatter the foundation." The FBI agents stepped forward in unison, physically securing Captain Collins's arms behind his back. The absolute authority of the uniform was stripped away in an instant, leaving only a terrified, broken, deeply prejudiced man facing the devastating, unavoidable consequences of his own hatred. Arthur turned his back on them. He touched the inner pocket of his suit jacket, feeling the soft, worn cotton of his mother's handkerchief resting safely against his heart. The ledger was finally being balanced. The sky now belonged to him. The digital blast radius of Flight 882 could not be contained by the sophisticated, heavily funded public relations machinery of corporate aviation. The raw, unedited, high-definition footage captured by Lucas's camera bypassed traditional media filters entirely. infecting the global digital consciousness with the terrifying, uncontrollable speed of a synthetic pathogen. Within 48 hours of the federal raid on the O'Hare tarmac, the visual evidence of the blood soaking into the Loro Piana cashmere, the cruel mechanical ratcheting of the tactical restraints, and the horrifying silent complicity of the premium cabin shattered the carefully curated illusions of American air travel. It was a visceral, unvarnished broadcast of systemic, unchecked brutality, uploaded directly into the unforgiving court of public opinion. The collective societal outrage manifested instantly in plummeting stock valuations, massive corporate boycotts trending across all key demographics, and a furious, unrelenting legislative demand for a sweeping federal reckoning. That reckoning arrived with crushing gravitational force 6 weeks later. Deep inside the mahogany-paneled cavern of Hearing Room 14B, at the Dirksen Federal Courthouse in downtown Chicago, the climate-controlled air inside the courtroom smelled distinctly of oxidized floorwalk, old leather, and cold, impending institutional ruin. Arthur Hayes sat motionless at the plaintiff's table, a study in absolute terrifying composure. The deep laceration on his temple had healed into a thin, pale, crescent-shaped scar, a permanent physical receipt of the violence that he wore not as a mark of victimization, but as a badge of surviving a deeply flawed system. He did not turn his head to look at the defense table. He did not need the visual confirmation of their panic. The frantic, desperate energy radiating from the airline's massive, highly compensated legal team was a tangible, vibrating frequency in the room. The distinct aura of men rapidly realizing their exorbitant billable hours could not purchase a different objective reality. Eleanor Bennett leaned forward, adjusting the flexible neck of the witness stand microphone with a steady, age-spotted hand. A retired federal judge who had occupied seat 3A on the diverted flight, her physical presence carried the crushing, undeniable weight of decades of judicial infallibility. She possessed the sharp, unforgiving, analytical gaze of a woman who had spent 40 years systematically separating desperate perjury from empirical truth. The hostility directed at the plaintiff was neither provoked by his actions nor ambiguous in its intent. Her voice, projected clearly through the amplification system, left absolutely zero room for legal interpretation or semantic maneuvering. It was a targeted, systematic, and aggressive degradation of a passenger who offered zero physical or verbal resistance. The entire flight crew operated with a terrifying, unspoken synchronicity of racial bias, treating his very existence in that premium cabin as an intolerable, punishable offense. The lead defense attorney, a heavy-set man sweating profusely into his heavily starched white collar, attempted to nervously introduce the vague concepts of aviation protocol adherence, crew anxiety, and perceived unpredictable cabin threats. James Foster, the logistics CEO who had been quietly sitting in seat 1C, systematically dismantled that fragile defense an hour later. Foster leaned his elbows on the polished wooden partition, his features hardened by decades of ruthless corporate pragmatism. There was absolutely no threat to the safety of that aircraft. There was a quiet, compliant man asking to receive his purchased meal, and a flight attendant who looked at him as if he were a biological infection. The only actual danger in that cabin was the crew's absolute arrogant certainty that they could physically and verbally abuse him without facing a single consequence. The devastating eyewitness testimonies were merely the foundation of the prosecution's strategy. The total structural collapse of the airline's legal defense occurred precisely when Arthur's legal team introduced Exhibit 404-B into the federal record. It was a massive encrypted digital cache of internal corporate communications, seized and decrypted by federal cyber investigators leading straight to the executive suites of the regional management offices. Edward Mitchell, the regional director of passenger operations, had spent 5 highly compensated years constructing a shadow architecture of exclusion. The internal emails were projected onto the massive high-definition screens framing the courtroom walls. They meticulously detailed an unwritten, highly illegal policy casually labeled the aesthetic standard, a coded systemic directive actively encouraging gate agents and flight crews to hyper-scrutinize, arbitrarily downgrade or entirely deny boarding to passengers belonging to specific minority demographics under the protected nebulous guise of security intuition. An empire built on systemic exclusion is simply a prison equipped with better marketing. The damning words flashed brightly across the retinas of everyone in the gallery, exposing the sickening, clinical, sanitized language Mitchell had utilized to justify his deeply entrenched racism. He had effectively quantified prejudice, transforming ugly bigotry into a celebrated metric for operational efficiency and premium brand protection. Edward Mitchell sat frozen in the gallery rows, his face rapidly draining of all blood. The protective arrogance that had seamlessly fueled a half-decade of discriminatory executive management evaporated instantly in the harsh, unforgiving fluorescent light of federal exposure. The Department of Justice prosecutors did not merely present the printed emails. They wielded them like a surgical scalpel, meticulously and ruthlessly excising the toxic rot from the corporate body. The heavy wooden gavel fell, and the judicial shockwave rippled outward, finding each individual architect of the abuse with predatory, inescapable accuracy. William Bradley's personal destruction occurred 300 miles away, sealed inside the glass-walled, panoramic boardroom of his own Manhattan private equity firm. He had arrogantly assumed his massive accumulated wealth and his fabricated victimhood narrative would permanently insulate him from the fallout. He had catastrophically underestimated the ruthless, emotionless calculus of corporate survival. The 8 senior board members sat in absolute suffocating silence as the raw, unedited footage of Flight 882 played in high definition on the central 70-inch monitor. They watched Bradley's flushed, scotch-soaked face aggressively demand the immediate removal of a quiet man who was simply reviewing financial models. They watched his manufactured panic, the weaponization of his racial fragility that directly initiated the horrific violence. The video ended, cutting to black. The silence in the sprawling boardroom was absolute, entirely devoid of pity or camaraderie. The toxic liability you have unilaterally introduced to this firm is catastrophic and uncontainable. The senior managing partner did not raise his voice a single decibel. He slid a single crisp sheet of legal paper across the expanse of the polished granite table. Your position here is completely untenable. Our largest institutional clients are actively withdrawing massive capital reserves based solely on your public association with our brand. You will sign this immediate resignation, forfeiting your entire portfolio of equity shares under the morality and reputation clause of your founding contract. Bradley's jaw slackened in profound shock. He reached for the heavy silver pen, his hands trembling violently, the color leaving his face. I built this firm from the ground up. You cannot erase my entire legacy because of one heavily edited misunderstanding on a commercial airplane. You cannot edit the high-definition footage of your own undeniable cruelty. The partner's gaze was dead, totally stripped of decades of shared history and friendship. Building security is currently waiting in the exterior corridor. You have exactly 10 minutes to clear your personal effects from the office. Months later, Bradley sat entirely alone in a sterile, echoing luxury condominium. The divorce papers signed, the majority of his assets liquidated to cover the aggressive civil settlements. He stared blankly at the breathtaking skyline, a man who possessed a view of the entire world but had been completely exiled from participating in it. Edward Mitchell's reckoning was far less elegant, entirely stripped of any remaining corporate civility or golden parachutes. He stood rigidly before a stern federal judge, the heavy steel chains binding his wrists clinking loudly against the scarred wooden podium. The federal conviction for conspiracy to violate civil rights and widespread corporate fraud carried a devastating mandatory minimum sentence. You willfully weaponized corporate policy to enforce your own vile bigotry, Mr. Mitchell. The judge's voice echoed powerfully through the high, vaulted ceilings of the courtroom. You institutionalized hatred behind a desk. You will spend the next 72 months in a federal penitentiary, contemplating the horrific architecture of your executive decisions. The heavy oak doors at the rear of the courtroom swung open. Two massive federal marshals gripped Mitchell's biceps tightly, steering him aggressively toward the concrete holding cells. The mechanical echoing clank of the heavy iron deadbolt sliding home was the final inescapable punctuation on a lucrative career built entirely on the systemic deprivation of others. For Richard Collins, the descent was a slow, agonizing daily hemorrhage of his core identity. The FAA disciplinary board convened less than a month after the violent incident. They did not merely suspend his commercial pilot's license, they shredded it, entering his name and credentials into a permanent, unappealable federal registry of decertified aviators. The airline's board of directors, now operating firmly under Arthur's absolute unforgiving mandate, aggressively stripped Collins of his substantial corporate pension, publicly citing gross misconduct and the willful initiation of unlawful, excessive force. 14 grueling months later, the relentless, freezing gray sleet of a Chicago November lashed violently against the cracked windshield of a battered, rust-spotted delivery van. Collins gripped the worn plastic steering wheel, his once immaculate silver hair unkempt and overgrown, his broad shoulders permanently slumped under the crushing, invisible weight of his new, degrading reality. He navigated the sprawling, potholed industrial logistics yards of the bleak outer suburbs. A man who used to confidently command the pristine skies, now heavily reduced to shuttling damp cardboard boxes for minimum hourly wages. He pulled the heavy van up to a concrete loading dock. A 23-year-old warehouse supervisor, holding a digital clipboard and chewing gum loudly, yelled through the freezing downpour, aggressively berating the former captain for missing a narrow delivery window by 4 minutes. Collins swallowed the acidic bile rising rapidly in his throat. He nodded submissively, absorbing the blatant disrespect, his mind involuntarily flashing back to the pristine 4 gold stripes he had once worn on his epaulets, to the absolute unquestioned authority he had foolishly squandered for the fleeting satisfaction of his own prejudice. Accountability is a terrifying, unyielding mirror that prejudice absolutely refuses to look into. He was forced to stare into that shattered glass every single grueling, humiliating day of his ruined life. Barbara Jenkins found her permanent ruin at the absolute bottom of a cheap plastic bucket smelling heavily of toxic industrial bleach. The massive civil lawsuits initiated by Arthur's legal team had completely decimated her life savings within 3 months. The viral infamy attached to her face and name had rendered her permanently unemployable in any customer-facing sector of the modern economy. The Global Airline Alliance had securely blacklisted her social security number across their entire international network. Her husband, entirely unable to withstand the crushing social pariah status and the relentless, terrifying financial hemorrhaging, had filed for an expedited divorce, aggressively taking the suburban house and the remaining assets in the final settlement. She knelt painfully on the cracked, filthy tile of a desolate highway rest stop bathroom, 30 desolate miles outside the city limits. A heavy, stained yellow rubber glove protected her right hand as she scrubbed a stiff-bristled, heavily worn brush against the black grime deeply embedded in the floor grout. The harsh, flickering, dying fluorescent light above cast deep, exhausted, bruised shadows under her bloodshot eyes. A weary traveler walked into the restroom, carelessly dropping a crumpled wet paper towel onto the slick floor mere inches beside Barbara's aching knee. without a single downward glance of acknowledgement. Barbara stopped scrubbing. Her chest hitched violently, a dry sob tearing at her throat. The vivid, haunting memory of the first-class cabin assaulted her senses. The rich smell of warmed mixed nuts, the delicate, musical clinking of crystal champagne flutes, the absolute, intoxicating power she had casually wielded with a simple flick of her eyes. She had thrown her entire comfortable existence away, just to maliciously demean a quiet man who had simply asked for the basic dignity of his purchase. She squeezed her eyes shut tightly, the harsh, burning fumes of the bleach stinging her nostrils, trapping her forever in a bleak, inescapable prison constructed entirely of her own miserable hubris. While the arrogant architects of the abuse blindly navigated their own personal, customized purgatories, Arthur Hayes fundamentally and ruthlessly dismantled the systemic machinery that had protected and enabled them for decades. The defining press conference took place in the soaring, glass-domed architectural marvel of Vance Capital's Chicago headquarters. Flanked closely by elite civil rights attorneys, federal regulators, and the newly appointed, highly diversified board of directors of the airline, Arthur stepped confidently to the podium. The cameras flashed relentlessly, a synchronized, blinding storm of global media attention. Corporate power entirely devoid of fundamental empathy is merely a blunt weapon. Power directed with unwavering purpose is a lasting legacy. Arthur's deep baritone resonated powerfully through the massive atrium, steady, commanding, and absolute. Today, we are officially implementing the Vance Protocol across the entire global operational grid of this transportation network. The new corporate mandate was ruthless in its transparency and efficiency. High-definition, audio-enabled body cameras were immediately and permanently integrated into the daily uniforms of all customer-facing personnel, stretching from the terminal ticket counters to the sealed flight decks. A decentralized, heavily funded third-party oversight committee was established, possessing the autonomous, unchallengeable authority to independently investigate and immediately terminate any employee exhibiting discriminatory behavior. The hidden biased software algorithms that previously flagged minority passengers based on flawed demographic profiles were permanently purged from the corporate mainframe, the code digitally burned to the ground. Within 18 highly scrutinized months, the statistical transformation of the airline was undeniable. Formal documented complaints of discriminatory treatment plummeted by an astonishing 92%. The corporate stock valuation, initially shattered into pieces by the viral fallout, rebounded aggressively, breaking historical records. It was fueled entirely by a massive new demographic of fiercely loyal consumers who recognized the reformed airline as the safest, most transparent, and most equitable carrier operating in the domestic airspace. The toxic culture of the sky had fundamentally shifted. A new industry standard had been violently forged in the fires of accountability, 2 years to the exact day after Flight 882. Touchdown on the frozen O'Hare tarmac under federal override, Arthur walked smoothly down Concourse B. He wore a flawlessly tailored charcoal Loro Piana suit, the immaculate fabric a quiet testament to impenetrable generational wealth. The slim leather briefcase in his right hand held the final expansion blueprints for the massive global logistics network he had successfully acquired and stabilized. The morning sunlight filtering beautifully through the massive terminal glass felt entirely different today. Cleaner, brighter, totally stripped of the oppressive, exclusionary shadows that used to haunt the corridors. He approached the priority boarding lane for the heavy morning route to Atlanta. The young gate agent, wearing a pristine, newly redesigned uniform complete with the small, blinking green lens of an active body camera, looked up from her monitor. Deep recognition dawned instantly in her eyes, followed immediately by a profound, unmistakable, and genuine respect. "Good morning, Mr. Hayes. It is a profound honor to have you flying with us today. Your cabin is prepared." Arthur nodded gently, returning the formal greeting with a genuine, quiet warmth. He walked down the carpeted jet bridge, stepping seamlessly into the first-class cabin. The ambient amber lights glowed softly, welcoming and serene. The flight crew stood at attention near the forward bulkhead. As he smoothly crossed the threshold, the lead flight attendant offered a slight, deeply respectful bow of her head. There was absolutely no hesitation. There was no calculating micropause. There was only the absolute flawless standard of equitable service. Arthur walked slowly past row 1. He stopped at row 2, sliding his leather briefcase carefully into the overhead bin directly above seat 2A. As he turned back toward the aisle, his dark gaze drifted through the heavy blue curtain separating the premium cabins. He watched the slow, shuffling, exhausted procession of economy passengers navigating the narrow space. Near the very front of the boarding line stood a young black teenager, no older than 17. The boy was wearing an oversized, faded gray hoodie and carrying a heavy, worn canvas backpack. His posture was rigid, his shoulders hiked up toward his ears. His eyes darted nervously around the luxurious, leather-clad cabin, physically projecting the deep, internalized, exhausting anxiety of someone who had been explicitly taught by a cruel world that he was trespassing in a protected space meant exclusively for others. Arthur felt the undeniable, grounding weight of the folded cotton handkerchief in his interior jacket pocket. The quiet, powerful echo of his mother's 40 years of silent endurance resonated deeply in the marrow of his bones. He stepped decisively through the curtain, moving gracefully against the heavy flow of boarding passengers. He stopped directly in front of the nervous teenager, effectively halting the line. The boy froze instantly, his eyes widening in sudden apprehension, expecting an immediate reprimand, expecting to be aggressively cast out. Arthur reached smoothly into his tailored jacket, retrieving his heavy premium cardstock boarding pass. He held it out, extending his hand. "Take seat 2A." Arthur's voice was low, steady, and entirely devoid of any condescending pity. It was a firm command rooted in absolute, unshakable solidarity. The teenager stared down at the golden priority stamp ticket, then slowly looked up at Arthur's calm, authoritative face. "Sir, my ticket is for row 34 in the back. Your ticket is now for row 2. Arthur pressed the heavy boarding pass directly into the boy's trembling palm. He leaned in slightly, his dark eyes locking onto the teenager's terrified gaze, transmitting a massive, invisible current of undeniable strength and belonging. "I like the view from the back. It reminds me exactly where I came from. But if anyone on this aircraft questions your right to sit in that premium seat, you hand them this." Arthur retrieved a heavy, embossed black business card from his pocket, sliding it over the ticket. "And you tell them to call me." The boy swallowed hard, his fingers tightening securely around the ticket and the card like a sudden lifeline thrown into a turbulent sea. He nodded once, a slow, brilliant, dawning realization washing over his youthful features. The fear evaporated. He stepped confidently past Arthur, walking tall into the warm amber glow of the first-class cabin, his spine straightening fractionally with every single step he took toward the front. Arthur watched him settle smoothly into the wide, caramel-colored leather seat. He smiled, a quiet expression of profound victory. He turned around and walked slowly down the long, narrow aisle of the economy cabin. He found row 34, a cramped, unforgiving middle seat squeezed tightly between two exhausted, sleeping travelers. He sat down. His knees immediately brushed hard against the rigid plastic seatback in front of him. The ambient, chaotic noise of the crowded cabin swelled around him. The crying infants, the rustling of cheap nylon luggage, the collective heavy fatigue of humanity in transit. Arthur closed his eyes as the massive twin engines whined to life, preparing for the heavy pushback from the gate. He felt the deep mechanical vibration travel through the floorboards, traveling up through his sneakers. He was no longer sitting in the isolated, luxurious seat of absolute power, but he had never in his entire life felt more completely in control. He had systematically bought the sky, not to separate himself from the earth, but to ensure that anyone could rise. The terrifying architecture of exclusion had been demolished, and the new legacy was definitively secure. When injustice happens to you, and you suddenly possess the rare, overwhelming power to fight back, your silence heavily impacts everyone who comes after you. You must fight not just for your own temporary comfort, but for the fundamental dignity of all of them.